is time for another microeconomics lesson. We've been thinking about supply and demand, but what about disequilibrium? Hit pause and see how much you can remember from the unit so far. The broad definition of PED is that it measures the responsiveness of quantity demand to a change in price. The formula to calculate PED is the percentage change in quantity demand divided by the percentage change in price. If the absolute value of PED is less than 1, we have an inelastic demand, and if the absolute value of PED is greater than 1, we have an elastic demand. The definition of a PED with an inelastic demand is that the change in quantity demand will be less than proportional than the change in price. The definition for an elastic demand is that the change in quantity demand will be more than proportional than the change in price. YED, the income elasticity of demand, measures the responsiveness of demand to a change in national income. We calculate YED by taking the percentage change of quantity demand and divided by the percentage change in income. If we have a negative answer, we know it's an inferior good. If we get a positive answer, we know it's a normal good. Between 0 and 1, it's a necessity, and greater than 1, it's a luxury. When we see an increase in income, we would expect to see a fall in demand for inferior goods. With normal necessities, an increase in income would see an increase in demand that is less than proportional, and with normal luxury goods, we'd expect to see an increase in income causing a more than proportional increase in demand. XED is the cross-elasticity of demand, and this measures the responsiveness of quantity demand of good A through a change in price of good B. To calculate the value of XED, we take the percentage change in quantity demanded of good A and divide it by the percentage change in price of B. If we get a positive result, we know that we have substitute goods. If we get a negative result, we know we have complementary goods. So when the price of good B goes up, the quantity demanded of good B goes down as always. But with substitute goods, consumers will switch and start consuming more of good A. Whereas with complementary goods, when the price of good B goes up, again, as always, the quantity demanded of good B will go down. But if they are complementary goods, the quantity of good A will also go down. PES is the price elasticity of supply, and this measures the responsiveness of supply to a change in price. The formula to calculate this is the percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price. If we get a decimal answer for PES, so that the value is less than 1, we know we have an inelastic supply. If our PES value is greater than 1, we have an elastic supply. An inelastic PES tells us that the change in quantity supplied is less than proportional than the change in price. And an elastic PES tells us that the change in quantity supplied is more than proportional than the change in price. Leave me a comment telling me how much of that you managed to remember. So the objectives from our lesson today are to know the 3 functions of the price mechanism and to be able to draw a diagram that shows the effect of disequilibrium. The market mechanism facilitates the determination of prices for goods and services in a market. Sometimes it's called the price mechanism, and this is what Adam Smith referred to as the invisible hand. It's hard to imagine a world without capitalism and without the free market. If you consider all the information that would be required to try and plan for every household's choices, consider what they would spend their money on, and then plan for the correct amount of goods and services to be produced, it would be a monumental amount of information to process. Adam Smith recognized that this information is essentially conveyed through the price mechanism. He said it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but for their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our necessities, but of their advantage. It will never cease to amaze me that we have a system in which everyone focuses on their own wants and needs. They are free to make choices, and they are able to act selfishly. Yet the result is millions of people collaborating to produce the food on your plate and the clothes on your back. If we just consider the simple hamburger on the screen, the amount of labour that went into making that is incredible. There were people who cleared the land to raise the cattle. There were people who raised the cattle, slaughtered the cattle, processed the cattle. There is cheese that also came from cattle. There is tomato that was grown and picked and transported, likewise with the lettuce. The wheat for the bread bun was grown, it was harvested, it was refined, it was sent somewhere else to become bread. It was then transported to the local fast food shop that you bought your burger from. Those people don't know each other, they won't ever meet, and they don't even speak the same language. And yet their work all combined to making your burger because it was in their self-interest. So let's look at this price mechanism to understand how incredibly powerful it is when everyone just works in their own self-interest and the problems that are caused when we fall into disequilibrium. I'm going to start by drawing my supply to my sky and the demand down, and I'm going to draw on my equilibrium quantity and my equilibrium price. We can see that if the price were to fall arbitrarily, then we would see an extension along the demand curve and an increase in quantity demand, but a contraction along the supply curve and a fall in quantity supplied. This difference would be excess demand, and in the real world, an excess of demand for burgers would be a shortage of burgers. Let's flip this question on its head. What would happen if there was a sudden, unexplained rise in price? Well, I've got my equilibrium quantity and my equilibrium price. If price were to rise, I would see a contraction along the demand curve. This would mean that quantity demanded would fall, and I'd see an extension along my supply curve, and I'd see an increase in quantity supplied. The gap between quantity supplied and quantity demanded is excess supply, which we would think about as a surplus of burgers. Get your flashcards out and write down what are the three functions of the price mechanism. Rationing. We know that there are infinite wants and scarce resources as the basic economic problem, and so when price increases, we see a contraction in demand and a reduction in quantity demanded. This rations the quantity that is available. Incentive. We know that firms aim to maximize profit. If we want to see an increase in production, they want to see an increase in price as an incentive. Signaling. As we mentioned earlier, there's a massive amount of information being conveyed through the price mechanism. If the price goes up, it signals to the producer to increase production because there is a greater demand for it. I'm going to run through some quick examples to get used to this language. If we were to see an increase in demand, the demand curve would shift to the right, forming a new equilibrium E2. This would cause an increase in price, which would be a signal to the producers to increase their supply. There would be an extension on supply to this new equilibrium point, and we would see an increase in quantity from Q1 to Q2. And as we are operating at an equilibrium, there is no surplus, there is no shortage. We are allocatively efficient at this equilibrium. But what if there was an increase in the cost of production? Well, we already know that supply would shift to the left, and we would see an increase in price at this new equilibrium. Fewer goods will be produced, but at this new higher price, there will be a contraction along demand to ration the amount that there is available, and we'll operate at an equilibrium at Q2. If a good was no longer popular, we'd see a fall in demand, which would mean a shift to the left. On our new demand curve, we've created an equilibrium E2, and at this equilibrium, we're operating at a new lower price. This new lower price would be a signal to producers to produce less of that good. We would see a contraction along supply and a fall in quantity supplied. Again, this means that operating at an equilibrium means that there is no shortage and no surplus of the good. We are allocatively efficient. Pause the video to see if you've understood everything I've taught you so far. So what is the function of the price mechanism? Well, option A said to ration scarce resources when the price rises and there is a surplus. Well, if the price was to rise, we'd see an extension along supply or a contraction along demand. If the price were to rise for no reason, we would not need to ration anything because there would be a surplus of a good. So it's not option A. Option B said to incentivize consumers to stop buying goods when the price is too low. Well, if the price was too low, we'd see an extension along demand. So that would not encourage them to stop buying goods when the price is too low. It is not B. C, to signal to producers that the quality needs to improve when the price is too high. Well, quality is not signaled through the price mechanism. But likewise, when the prices are too high, the only thing it signals to the suppliers is to increase their production. So it cannot be C. D, to signal to producers and consumers the changes in supply and demand. Well, if there's an increase in demand, we'd see an increase in price. This would signal to producers to increase production, and we'd see an extension in supply, and that would cause an increase in quantity supplied to Q1. If there was a fall in supply, we would see a new equilibrium form. This would increase the price, and it would ration the amount left for consumers, and so we're operating without there being a shortage. We were just operating at a new lower quantity Q1 that is allocatively efficient, and so D is the correct answer. It's the signal to producers and consumers the changes in supply and demand. Hit pause and have a go at these questions. It's so important that you have a go at questions yourself before watching the answers. Answer each question in full sentences and also include a diagram. If you can, consider the elasticity, initial equilibrium, changes, final prices, and quantity, and leave your chain of reasoning as part of your plan. The market for affordable housing is clearing. What would happen if the government forced the price of housing to fall? So I'll start by drawing my supply and my demand, and I'll be operating at an equilibrium. That's what's meant by the housing market is clearing. If the government set this max price below my equilibrium price, we would see a fall in price. But for supply, that would be a contraction and a fall in quantity supplied. For demand, that would be an extension. So there'd be an increase in quantity demanded. If we've got more demand than we have supply, we call this excess demand. But really, we know that excess demand in the context of housing is a housing shortage. And in addition to this, if you were able to consider the elasticity of demand, you should have drawn it as relatively steep because the demand for housing is inelastic. There are very few substitutes to affordable housing. So for question 5, you had to draw the diagram for BMW cars. The market for cars is clearing. What would happen if BMW put the price of their cars up? So I've drawn my axes, supply to the sky and demand down. I'm being very precise here. This is my market for BMW cars only, not all cars. So I've got my price 1 and my quantity 1 at the equilibrium. If, for reasons outside of the market, the price were to just randomly increase to P2, we would see that they're no longer operating at an equilibrium. So we would see a contraction in demand for BMW cars and a fall in quantity demanded to QD. We'd see an extension along supply and an increase in supply to QS. This would mean that there's excess supply of cars in the market. Excess supply would be a surplus, so there would be too many cars. Thank you so much for sticking with me to the end of the video. You only have one more lesson and you have completed Unit 1 of Microeconomics, Supply and Demand.